Okay, so welcome back to the channel. For those of you who haven't seen me for a while or haven't seen me before, my name's Matt. I specialise in basically building turbos and increasing the power output of the Insignia engine. At the moment is the one that I'm spending most of my time working on. The Insignia engine is a variant of the engine that was once found in the Z19, which was obviously the version that was in the Vectra, Astra, and many other engines. Now, what we're going to talk about today, or what I'm going to talk about to you, is I'm just going to try and answer some of the questions that people constantly message me about, so that maybe this could be of some help to you. So, questions that I often get asked are about things like intercoolers and stuff like that. Now, you can buy intercooler kits. Obviously, you can buy intercooler kits for the Insignia and for the Vectra and the Astra and many other platforms. They are incredibly expensive. Some of them are sort of £500-600. The benefit that you get with those is obviously that the piping and the trunking and everything else that you require and the bolt-on brackets and all of that sort of stuff comes with them. So you can bolt that literally straight to your car. If you're not massively experienced, then it's something that is quite useful, because it's relatively plug and play. Anybody who says something is literally just completely bolt-on plug and play is not being totally accurate. There are always going to be little challenges when we're doing things to cars which are not OEM spec. So if you're gonna, for example, put a new oil cooler, a Vauxhall oil cooler onto your engine, then the challenges are going to be relatively small. You're going to make a bit of a mess. You're probably going to need a few gaskets that you may not necessarily have expected. When you're changing a turbo to something which isn't OEM, which is something which has been made by someone else or built, then there are going to be things, little challenges that are going to come your way. So things like you may have to clock the turbo, which means basically that you have to rotate either the compressor or the turbine housing just to make things line up a little bit. Not particularly difficult, all within the skill set of most people. If you're gonna take on the challenge of changing a turbo, then undoing a few bolts and spinning it isn't something that should be a problem. In regards to intercoolers, are intercoolers worth it? Well, this is the question. I mean, some cars require intercooler upgrades more than others. So, for example, the Vectra intercooler isn't a particularly great piece of kit. It is sandwiched between the air conditioning condenser and the car's radiator. The problem with that is airflow through it is restricted by the condenser. Now, although this is quite similar to most modern cars and is in fact quite similar to the Insignia, what makes the difference with the Vectra is the Vectra's nose. So the Vectra's nose has got some gaps for the air to flow in through, and then obviously to hit the intercooler and take those temperatures down. But the gap isn't massive. If you picture the Insignia compared to the Vectra, the Insignia, like the Audis and stuff, has this massive, great, huge gap, almost like a mouth, and some modifiers even call it like the big mouth version. And that obviously allows a massive volume of air to be blasted through the aircon radiator and then obviously into the intercooler. And that helps bring temperatures down, which is what we want. We want to get as much airflow as we can over that intercooler. So with the Vectra, for example, you can actually remove the standard intercooler, which is a reasonable size, and actually replace it with something of a similar size, but move it slightly down in the actual bumper itself, so it sits directly in the airflow, and that can have a considerable effect, considerable positive effect. The Insignia itself doesn't require that as much, because of the fact that the airflow in through the Insignia's big mouth is much better and much more efficient. So the standard intercooler on the Insignia is actually quite an efficient piece of kit. The main reason for replacing it would be the fact that if you're looking to increase the boost pressure, the standard Insignia intercooler, like most standard intercoolers, has plastic end cans on it. Those plastic end cans are bolted to the or molded to the actual intercooler core, and there's a small rubber seal which runs all the way around. With increased boost and just age and wear and tear, and obviously the oil that you tend to find inside diesel intercoolers, it can damage that seal, and then the seal fails, and then obviously you get boost leaks, and that you could imagine the problems that creates. So changing the intercooler on an Insignia is not as beneficial as it would be on a Vectra, but it is still a reasonably decent upgrade, if nothing else, just for reliability. Other things that need to be taken into account, the Insignia injectors the 160 Insignia injectors are incredibly good pieces of kit, capable of actually flowing enough fuel for over 300 horsepower. And they are in fact an upgrade that the guys who are using the Z19 engines actually use when they're going over 300 horsepower, those and a few other SAB options. So the injectors are fine. The fuel pump itself, though, is not capable of a great deal more than about 260 horsepower. Gearboxes and clutches. So this is a constant thing that I see on forums all the time, where people are coming on and going, well, if you're going to need a remap, you're going to blow your clutch up. No, that's not the case. The standard clutch on the Insignia, and in fact on the Vectra, will take in a region of 450 Newton meters. It's the torque that causes the clutch to slip, just because of the shearing force between that sudden acceleration and sheer power of the torque involved in a diesel engine, and obviously the braking force of the engine acting through the flywheel. Those two opposing forces cause a shearing effect. The standard clutch will take, as I said, 450 Newton meters, maybe a little bit more. I've seen them take sort of 460, 470, so 450 for the standard one. Your average remap will take it up to about 430. With one of the turbo upgrades that I have, the GTB 1752, which is what we're currently recommending for the standard clutch. You can take the torque goes up to about 450, 460 Newton meters, which the standard clutch will take. There are things that you can do to protect it. So the mapping, for example, is critical. So because of the way that the Insignia Turbo accelerates, it is actually a very efficient piece of kit. The GTB Turbo series is really very good, and it's very capable of accelerating very rapidly. It is quite often very useful to get the mapping done correctly, so that the torque comes in quite a sort of linear way, which helps to protect the clutch, and in fact also helps to protect the gearbox. The Insignia 160 has the F40 gearbox on it, which is a very strong and durable piece of kit. It's used on a great number of the VXRs, who are all producing very good power of standard, really. The F40, as fitted to the Insignia 160, is capable of taking 400 Newton meters quite comfortably. It will take a great deal more than that, in my experience. In my experience, the F40 gearbox will quite happily run sort of 550 to 600 Newton meters without any great problems. The gearbox is very solid. The M32 gearbox, which is fitted to the Insignia 140s and the Insignia 130s, is a much smoother gearbox than the F40 version, but it isn't capable of taking the same kind of torque. It will take sort of, 350. Well, the numbers indicate the torque that they're rated for. So the M32 is actually rated to 320 Newton meters. To do obviously a remap on that would take it much higher. And as long as the gearbox is looked after, as long as the oil is changed regularly, and as long as it has a decent quality oil put in it, you should be fine at that level. A lot of guys have found that actually overfilling the M32 gearbox is a benefit. What has happened with the design of the M32 gearbox is that they've made the bearings ever so slightly smaller, so that it could take being a 6-speed gearbox. So they needed to find the the ability to be able to put that, because initially it was a 5-speed gearbox. They wanted to put that 6th gear in without having to go through the whole rigmarole of redesigning an entire gearbox. So what they did was they made the bearings ever so slightly smaller and narrower to accommodate the additional length required by that extra gear, which at standard power is not too much of a problem. But obviously, when you're pushing bigger power through it, it is a problem. What tends to happen is the bearings and the end casing fail simply because they're the ones furthest from the oil, and therefore they can get a little bit hotter and a little bit warmer than the rest of the bearings, which tend to be immersed in the oil. So a common modification for those gearboxes is to actually overfill them so that the end casing bearings are in fact constantly submerged in oil, and therefore they don't get as hot as they would do normally. You can actually get end casing bearing upgrades, which aren't too difficult to do. You can do it in place. There are a lot of garages that offer this service where they take the end casing off, take the 5th and 6th gear out, and slide off the sandwich plate that sits on the end of the gearbox with those bearings in it, and they put a new uprated bearing set back in there. That's quite a common modification, and it doesn't require the gearbox to be removed. Some of the other things that I constantly get asked about are the size of the intercooler pipes. So 2.25 is normally a fairly decent size with a decent compromise between sort of spool and actually volume. Obviously is important as well. You don't want to really compromise one at the cost of another. If you want to find out what sort of piping size is perfect for you, literally just Google it. There are plenty of studies where they show actually the size of the pipe, the amount of air that it can flow for a given horsepower expectation, and the sort of speed that you would expect to get through the pipe. Obviously, the larger the pipe that you get, the slower the air is going to move through it. You possibly harm velocity. However, it should be remembered that the air that's traveling through the intercooler and through the piping is moving not far off supersonic speeds at some points. So spool time is going to be affected, but are you going to notice it? No, not necessarily. I've seen guys go out and spend hundreds and hundreds of pounds on kits to try and improve their spool, and it hasn't really had all that much of an effect at all. Okay, going back to intercoolers, is it worth spending all this money on AirTech intercoolers? Well, not in my experience. In my experience, the eBay universal versions are virtually as good as the AirTech versions. A recent test that I did with my Vectra was very similar. We used an AirTech version on a friend's car with a similar setup, and then I used an eBay version. We did some heavy power runs up the road to get some heat into the engine and into the intercooler, just to see if heat soak would make any difference. The difference between the two was my eBay intercooler was actually about a degree hotter than his, which would have a very, very negligible effect on power output, if the truth be told. Whereas my entire kit, including the piping and everything else, cost me £200, whereas his was £600. Yes, when it came to fitting, his was a bolt-on, whereas mine was a sort of, cut and move this here and move that there. So it was more difficult to fit mine, 100%. But I would say that if you're confident in what you're doing, if you've got a basic knowledge and understanding of how an engine works, then you would be able to fit your own kit. So those eBay universal intercoolers, as long as the sizing is correct, would be absolutely fine. Just bear in mind, obviously, when you are positioning your intercooler, that you're probably going to need to take the front bumper off, and you probably are going to have to sort of if you're making one yourself as opposed to getting an AirTech kit, you are going to have to sort of make your own brackets to hold the intercooler. You are going to have to give it some thought as to where exactly it is that you're going to run your piping. What you want to avoid, if possible, is really harsh 90-degree bends. If you've got lots of really harsh 90-degree bends, obviously that's going to impact airflow. So try and make it as smooth as transition for the air as possible. Common sense type stuff, really. Next step for the Insignia build, we're doing a little bit of mapping at the moment to see what we can do with our current setup. The benefit that I think with the GTB 1752 is that you get really, really good spool. Data logs have now shown that spooling starts from 1800, which is a 200 RPM difference improvement over the standard version, which is really good. That's noticeable. We're now at full boost on the GTB 1752 before the standard turbo even begins to start spooling. So that makes the car massively more drivable. You're getting power earlier in the rev range. It's much more usable. When you're driving on the motorway, for example, when you're doing 75 miles an hour, you're in boost. Which makes the car great to drive. Great to drive around town, great to drive on the motorway. The other benefit, obviously, is that you've got an increased power output. We're taking it up to sort of 235 horsepower. We probably could push it a little bit further. The benefit with this kind of turbo over a hybrid version is that when a hybrid's made, what they do is they get the compressor wheel and they machine the cover to allow the compressor wheel to fit inside the standard cover. Now, the standard cover has got a set airflow, and it's going to struggle to cope with more air being pushed through it. The compressor cover that we're using is larger, so our compressor cover is capable of more airflow than a hybrid version. So although you may have a GTB 1756, your compressor cover is smaller than ours, and therefore ours will allow a higher flow of air through it. And the other benefit with that as well is that obviously if you have a greater volume of air, then you can add more fuel. So I would suggest that our turbo is comparable to the 1756. The benefit that we have is that obviously we have good spool, which to be fair you could also have with the 1756, but we can still use the standard clutch, we can still use the standard mass airflow sensor, we can still use the standard map sensor. We set boost to 2 bar, which allows for all of those sensors to be retained. So, the 1752 that we're currently producing gives us 240-ish horsepower. The 1756 would be capable of 260 horsepower, so an extra 20. Now, the problem that you have is with that extra 20 horsepower, which is a noticeable amount, but it isn't huge, you are going to have to change your map sensor. So you're probably looking at maybe £60-70 for that. A bigger MAF, probably another £100. The big one is a performance clutch. You are definitely going to need a performance clutch at that level. Performance clutch, just for the clutch itself, is £500. Obviously, it's massively sensible to change the dual mass flywheel while you're in there. So the point that I'm making is that 20 horsepower extra is going to cost you probably in the region of £1,000 to £1,500. You've got to ask yourself, is that actually sensible? Is it sensible to start looking at spending £1,500 to get an extra 20 horsepower? I would suggest not. I would also suggest that changing to a competition clutch is also going to harm drivability. You are then going to have later spool because you have a larger compressor. Yes, you will have big figures. Yes, you will have bigger numbers. Yes, you can show off about those bigger numbers. But in reality, will it make your car more drivable? No. In reality, will it harm drivability? Yes. So that's the question you've got to ask yourself. What's important to you? Do you want those big numbers? Or are you happy to spend that money? If you are, all power to you. If you want to be more sensible, you want to retain a car which is drivable, you want to spend reasonable sums of money and not throw money at it, then definitely the GTB 1752 is the way for you. In regards to comments, I'm more than happy to answer any comments. It's great to get feedback, even if it's negative feedback, even if it's questions which I haven't answered, is always good to get. So I hope to see some comments. I hope to see some subscribers. Not that we're planning to get any particular, any particular sponsorship or anything like that. Most of this is about showing the journey that I have made in building things for my own car, basically. It's also about helping other people try to achieve things which they might not necessarily else have been able to do. The Insignia is massively lacking in a tuning backup. The Vectra Astra and all those Signums and everything else have got a huge cult following in regards to tuning. There is lots of information freely available for those engines, and there's virtually none for the Insignia. So, I'd like to think that we're breaking a little bit of new ground with these things. Talking to several tuning companies in regards to remaps and stuff like that. So big shout out to Tom Procto and to Matt Ridgway especially, who have helped us with Matt in particular has helped a great deal with a lot of our development, a lot of the development for the new turbos for the Insignias and stuff like that. Great guy, always willing to help. Get in contact with him if you want to do any remapping. That's who does all my remapping for me. So he's a great guy. Anyway, as I've said, feel free to put the comments underneath and I will try and get back to them within 24 hours. Thank you very much. Bye.